muito bom dia a todos que vieram aqui conversar com a gente hoje, estar com a gente aqui. Nós estamos começando a nossa segunda Jornada Internacional de Pragmática. O meu nome, eu vou apresentar nós três que estamos aqui. O meu nome é Elena Godoi. Eu sou o líder do grupo, né? Linguagem, Cognição e Comunicação. Ao meu lado está o professor Sebastião Santos, né, que é o nosso vice-líder, o membro do nosso grupo desde sempre, e também já está com a gente o nosso primeiro convidado, o professor Jef Verschuren, que é da Bélgica e que é presidente da Associação Internacional da Pragmática. Ele veio nos prestigiar aqui, é o nosso amigo de longa data e está mais uma vez com a gente aqui. Tá? Obrigada, Jef. Eu vou contar só um pouquinho, temos pouco tempo, né? O que é o nosso grupo, quem somos, né? Nosso grupo existe já há 18 anos, já é bastante, alcançou maturidade quase, né? E desde sempre o nosso grupo que trabalha com pragmática mesmo, né? Enfim, a gente tem essa característica de fazer um trabalho interdisciplinar, por excelência. Ou seja, tanto a pragmática social, né, está o nosso foco, como a pragmática cognitiva. E isso sempre em diálogo com outras disciplinas, que sempre caracterizou o nosso grupo, porque a gente tem, muito engraçado, não só o pessoal de letras, mas o pessoal de letras que também vem de outras áreas. Enfim, a gente tem pessoas, né, os nossos membros que vêm da biologia, da filosofia, da lógica, do direito, então, da psicologia. Então, veja, as nossas pesquisas se centram na pragmática, social e cognitiva, né? E ultimamente eu devo confessar o grupo tende para a pragmática mais cognitiva, mas sem perder de vista o social, né? E ultimamente, como vocês vão ver pelas apresentações de hoje, a gente conversa com outras áreas do conhecimento humano, com outras áreas da prática humana, da atividade humana. Então, a comunicação humana que acontece por tudo, toda hora, todo dia, toda hora, todo segundo, e não tem como se desvencilhar. Então, vocês vão ver que a gente trabalha com a comunicação organizacional, por exemplo, comunicação é pragmática no ensino de línguas, no ensino em geral, a pragmática que toca e dialoga e busca o porquê, né? A gente é como é, né? O ser humano é como é, na evolução humana. E nesses últimos, eu diria, 2 anos, a gente está começando a desbravar o que não existe no Brasil ainda, a chamada pragmática clínica. Como vai ficar claro hoje à tarde na apresentação de uma colega nossa, tá? Não quero dizer que a gente se meta a ser psicoterapeuta ou sei lá o quê, né? Médico, muito menos, enfim, né? Mas que a questão é que a comunicação está em tudo e, como pragmaticistas, a gente tem como conversar com essas áreas e contribuir com essas áreas. Então, é isso que a gente vai querer mostrar para vocês hoje. Então, perdão. Eu fico muito feliz que posso apresentar para vocês já, como apresentamos já, o professor Jef, que vai começar daqui a pouquinho. Não é à toa que os nossos convidados, o professor Jef, agora de manhã, e o professor Daniel à tarde, eles trabalham mais profundamente com a pragmática social, tá? Com as vertentes sociais da pragmática. É muito valioso para nós que a pragmática social também não esteja no nosso foco, que a gente possa trabalhar. Então, eu passo a palavra para o professor Sebastião, por favor, que ele também, umas pinceladinhas, ele vai colocar. Por favor, Sebastião.
Obrigado, Helena. Bom dia a todos, sejam todos bem-vindos a esta segunda Jornada Internacional de Pragmática, né? Só queria contar uma historinha para vocês. Este evento surgiu das ideias da Crisbele, da Helena e mais alguns alunos, né, da pós-graduação, especialmente do nosso grupo Linguagem, Comunicação e Cognição. Em 2019, então, a gente fez o primeiro evento, né, a primeira jornada, né, no dia 10 de dezembro. Né? Dia 10 de dezembro, e 3 meses depois a gente realizou o quarto VIP, né, o Workshop Internacional de Pragmática, né, no dia 10 e 11 de março. E no dia seguinte a universidade fechou as portas por causa da pandemia. Então, desde então, a gente está trabalhando, né, via a tecnologia, né, digital. E o nosso convidado de hoje, o Jef Verschuren, já esteve conosco em edições do terceiro VIP, né? Anteriormente, que foi uma honra muito grande para a gente. Né? E no quarto VIP, que a gente apresentou lá em março, nós tivemos a honra também de ter o Sperber, né? O Dan Sperber, que nos brindou com a sua palestra. Então, só para inteirar, né? Esse é um pouquinho do nosso histórico dessa uma pequena caminhada, porque tem os WIPs anteriores, né? Da nossa caminhada desse grupo maravilhoso que a gente se encontra a cada 15 dias, aos sábados, enquanto muita gente vai para as baladas, agora não pode mais, mas nós, este grupo que está aqui, né, nós nos encontramos a cada 15 dias, né, para discutir teorias, para discutir ideias, né, e para discutir, enfim, os caminhos nossos da pragmática, né, da pragmática nossa de cada dia que a gente tem. Né? Então, o evento de hoje, como a Helena já disse, essas duas, além das palestras, né, do Jef e do Daniel à tarde, teremos os minicursos, né, aliás, as mesas redondas, né, e os minicursos com a Crisbele, com a Letícia, o Rodrigo, né, e a Marina. Então, fiquem conosco, sejam bem-vindos, e hoje é um dia de, como eu gosto de dizer, de grandes emoções.
Please, Jef. Is you now? Are you now?
So you mean it's my turn? Can you hear me? You can hear me, right? So I take this out. It's easier to talk for me that way. Now, in fact, I will be giving a very old-fashioned talk, just a talk. That means I don't need to share my screen. I don't have to show you any slides. That makes it a bit easier, I think. Now, I was told that the topic of the conference was pragmatics, circulation of hate and resistance. Now, the problem that I first want to address is, now, why this kind of conference topic? And it's not difficult to give an answer to that. The answer probably has to do with the fact that we do live in relatively troubled times. So these times are troubled in a very general sense, and there is nothing new about that. It's not so different now than it used to be at other times in history. So there are international tensions, and there is always the need, apparently, to create new enemies when old ones have outlived their usefulness. So, and there is also, in general, the persistence of seriously repressive regimes and so on. But apart from these things, we are also living in troubled times in the more traditional liberal democracies. What is not new is the fact that there is polarization. There is always polarization, and to a certain extent, that is also necessary for a democracy. Polarization, different points of view in conflict with each other, they can be the basis for constructive negotiation and action. But in addition to the polarization, which is not new at all, there is a new phenomenon that has come our way, namely the vast expansion of communication technologies, of which we are witnessing one example now by me being able to be present at a doctoral defense in Nanjing in China this morning, and giving a talk in Brazil right now. But communication technology has also had some negative effects. It has, in the sense that it has given people their individual megaphones. So if you get a polarized society in which people at different extremes use the communication technology as a megaphone for their own personal views, and in addition to that, they are able to create bubbles of meaning, then you always run the risk of getting a breakdown of real communication. And there are people always who know how to manipulate new circumstances, and they really do so. And that is why you do indeed get a kind of massive circulation of hate, which is a concept in the title of your conference. And then the problem is, how do you respond to that? There are definitely two possible ways of responding. One is you can collaborate. And the temptation to collaborate is always there, because the temptation of achieving positions of influence and power, that's not foreign to people in general. But there is another way to respond, namely you can also try to resist. And resisting is something in this kind of context that you can do by means of instant action, using the same communication technologies. But the result of that is usually that new bubbles of meaning are created in opposition to other bubbles of meaning. Another way of resisting is by more slowly and painstakingly and probably more sustainably using the tools of education. But in order to use the tools of education, you need foundations for that. And that is why you also need basic research. And this gets us into a form of academic resistance that we can try to put up. Now, academic resistance can consist in analyzing the processes that are involved. And this is done in a very direct way by sociologists, by communication scientists, by political scientists. But we can also try to do it more indirectly by analyzing the discourse that underlies or carries or supports or maintains the processes that we're talking about. And that is where then the other element of the title of your conference comes in, namely pragmatics. Pragmatics, which for me is still very simply to be defined as the science of language use. Now, and on the basis of research that we do, we can try to advocate action, forms of action. Now, then the question is, now what is my contribution today? Well, I mentioned collaboration and resistance as possible ways of responding to a troubled context, a troubled communication context as well. But there is a very shady field in between collaboration and resistance, and that is a field which is, I would call, complicity. And it is that topic of complicity that I want to address today. And my main question is, to what extent do we share responsibility for the processes as we see them evolving? The main tool that I will be using is a bird's eye view of practices, which I look at as couched in discourse, though there will be very little direct discourse or language analysis in the talk that I will be giving now. So to give detailed examples, well, the time span that I have available wouldn't be sufficient for that. So I will just be giving a bird's eye view of practices couched in discourse, situated in three different fields, namely the field of society at large, and more specifically, they're focusing on politics in the face of diversity. Another field that I will be briefly talking about is the field of higher education as an example of a type of neoliberal institution context. And then the third field that I will be looking at briefly also is the media. Now, media and higher education will be touched upon very briefly because I will be spending most of my time talking about processes that take place at the level of society at large. And my goal is then to show that an analysis of the extent to which we share responsibility also allows us to take responsibility, and taking responsibility is a tool of resistance. And it's also a way to restore hope, maybe. Now, indignation and anger are very important emotions. We have seen a lot of indignation and anger in the last 10 to 20 years, well, probably longer than that, but my memory time span is not that long. So we have seen anger and indignation in the face of economic exploitation, and I don't have to give you the details of that. There is a lot of that. There is a lot of inequality. We have seen anger and indignation in the face of terror. We have seen it in the face of racism. We have seen it in the face of neglect for the environment. So we have seen movements like the Indignados, the Occupy movements, the Gilets jaunes in France, Black Lives Matter everywhere, Extinction Rebellion, and so on. And these are all very important movements. But emotions like indignation and anger, they are relatively simple because all they need to do is to identify bearers of responsibility and using them as targets. But responsibility, in fact, is more diffuse than we would like it to be. So if we look at society, just diving in at the deep end, at the less pleasant sides of society, let's have a very brief look at the relationship between terror and complicity. You all remember the 22nd of July 2011, when Anders Breivik in Norway, when he exploded his homemade fertilizer bomb in the government district of Oslo, killing 9 people, then took the ferry to an island, Utøya, where he, in cold blood, shot 69 kids to death. And just before he did all of that, he had published on the internet a 1,518-page compendium identifying cultural Marxists as complicit in the Islamization of Europe. So he declared the leftist side of society as guilty to that, and therefore people deserve to be killed. Now, so he uses complicity as a notion to justify his actions. Now, the notion of complicity in this case was also used in a different way. Namely, it was also attributed to far-right politicians expressing sympathy for Breivik's ideology. Now, even far-right politicians in that period, they stayed away from expressing open sympathy for what Breivik did, but they did express sympathy for the ideology underlying his actions. Now, and so the opportunity was used to point a finger at the extreme left of the extreme right of the political spectrum, saying, well, okay, they are guilty for what Breivik did because they are supporting his ideas, so they are complicit. Now, the controversy was relatively short-lived for a number of reasons. It was short-lived because the two outspoken far-right people were usually marginalized by their own parties because it was not a very popular opinion to voice at that moment. But it was also short-lived, of course, because there was no legal accountability to be indicated in relation to the ideology of the extreme right. If you would identify legal accountability on their side for what Breivik did, then you would also have to say that pro-life activists in general are responsible for what other pro-lifers do when they bomb an abortion clinic. And that is obviously, it's obviously not as simple as that. And this does not only count for far-right politicians. It's very difficult to pin down legal accountability on them, but that's also the case for instance, in this specific event, for the online businesses that provided Breivik with fertilizer for the bomb that he made, or for the police uniform that he used as a cover to cross over to the island of Utøya. It also counts for the ferry captain who takes him across. It also counts for the people who sold him guns and ammunition. It also counts for the shooting club where he was able to practice shooting. It also counts for the designers of the game World of Warcraft, which Breivik was playing for a year to desensitize himself. Now, they all to a certain extent enabled his actions, but they cannot be held legally accountable. And very similar kinds of arguments can be made in relation to many of the 150,000 incidents that are classified as terrorist between 1970 and 2015 in the global terrorism database. But does that mean that politicians and others supporting Breivik's views can escape all responsibility? Now, evaluating that kind of question is very tricky business. So the question is someone automatically exonerated by good intentions? So can praiseworthy goals be put in the balance against indirect support for wrongdoing? And there are many examples that can be given to illustrate the difficulty of that question. Like, for instance, if an NGO is devoted to aid and development, does its relationship with governments and the private sector thwart to a certain extent movements for social change and justice by supporting neo-colonial capitalist structures? Well, can their relationships, can they be charged of being accomplices in those neoliberal capitalist structures if their relationships with those governments and with the private sector, if they are their tools to be able to provide aid in a context of development. In the same way, is negotiating with warlords blameworthy if it is the only way to provide humanitarian aid? Or what about the quite laudable goal of the United Nations to remain non-interventionist if their non-interventionism enables war crimes and genocide, as has been the case on a number of occasions? Just remember Srebrenica in ex-Yugoslavia or Rwanda. Now, does this also mean that there is no trace of guilt for Breivik's actions in people contributing to the general anti-Islamic social and political atmosphere if they just see themselves as telling the truth about Islam as a dangerous religion incompatible with Western norms and values? Now, in addition to intentionality, there is another thing to consider when evaluating responsibility, namely someone's position of influence and power. Underlying all action, whether it is blameworthy or not, whether it is individual or collective, there is always a layer of ideas or ideologies. Now, ideas are not the product of individual minds. Most people are not that original. But ideas, they spread in a field of socially distributed cognition. And they can either be accepted by individuals or they can be rejected by individuals. But as individuals, we rarely know where they eventually come from. But still, if we hold certain ideas, they are the basis for our actions. Now, so underlying all action, there is ideas. And people with power and influence can do more than others to determine the direction of ideological development. Intellectuals may have a lot of influence. Just think about the French author Renaud Camus with his contribution to the white genocide conspiracy theory, so the Great Replacement. But there are not only intellectuals, there are also politicians, and politicians combine with influence also a certain amount of power. And so if you then see, for instance, things such as, or people like Angela Merkel, so German Chancellor, Nicolas Sarkozy, when he was still president of France, David Cameron, when he was still Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, when you see them in the time span of a couple of weeks, all in unison, declaring the failure of multiculturalism, then the question is, if you have such powerful politicians who are so influential, if they contribute to the kinds of ideas that underlie actions such as those that Breivik undertook. And Breivik actually, he quotes Merkel, Sarkozy, and Cameron on their statements about the failure of multiculturalism. Now, if you see that, well, can they be regarded as totally not responsible for what was happening? Politics has, in fact, a very central role to play in all of this. Analyzing politically stimulated complaints about the failure of multiculturalism, which we can do as pragmaticians, as discourse analysts, it usually leads to the conclusion that what it is based on is a complaint or dissatisfaction about or dissatisfaction with remaining diversity. Now, so if you get politicians to complain about the failure of multiculturalism, that probably means the success of multiculturalism, because it probably means that there are still differences, that there are still differences that they don't like. And now, if you talk about diversity and differences, and you try to evaluate what the relationship is between democracy and diversity, then you must come to the conclusion that a true democracy must give openness to diversity. And why is that? That is very simply because of basic principles of human rights. It is maybe a little old-fashioned to use the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a standard, but probably it hasn't been replaced yet by a better standard. It is a little bit culturally biased and so on, and historically it has a specific background that we wouldn't all agree with. But if you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, then you see that just about all the articles begin with all, or everyone, or no one, which means that compliance must be evaluated at the level of the individual. And the individual is by definition the confluence of multiple dimensions of diversity. So, and I don't have to enumerate them, but I'll enumerate some of them anyway. There are age, gender, sexual orientation, physical appearance, health, language, social background, descent, nationality, education, profession, religion, lifestyle, and so on and so forth. Now, democracy, if you look at it as the guardian of human rights, which are to be situated at the level of the individual, then democracy is quite contrary, or must be contrary, to attempts to impose a set of culture or identity-related norms beyond those that reflect basic human rights and beyond those that reflect their operationalization by means of local law. And saying this runs the risk of getting accused of cultural relativism, but it is not cultural relativism, because it is not making the claim that all cultural practices are of equal value. Definitely not, because there are some cultural practices that are themselves violations of basic human rights. Now, openness to diversity is in liberal societies today seriously under attack as a result of the development of new forms of nationalism. Now, and in this context, within the analysis of discourses around this, I think it has been a mistake to start talking about super diversity. It has been a mistake in spite of the fact that it was an attempt to underscore the reality of diversity, and it is necessary to underscore that reality. And it is true, definitely, and that's also an idea underlying the notion of super diversity. It is true that increased mobility and versatile communication technologies have influenced the shape of diversity and patterns of behavior. But societies, if you look at diversity at the level of the individual, societies are super diverse by definition, and they always have been. And the new term dramatizes the situation out of proportion by suggesting an exceptional degree of fragmentation, and this is a very counterproductive thing to do if you try to counter the nationalist movements towards uniformity. Now, in this context, a very common rhetorical pattern has developed. So a rhetorical pattern according to which leftist multiculturalists of the 1990s were naive and irresponsible, which has resulted in essentialist separation, segregation of different ethnic groups, And this is then supposed to undermine social cohesion on the basis of common values. It is supposed to be culturally relativistic to the extent that those who are attacking multiculturalism would say that multiculturalists would accept forced marriages and honor killings, which is of course total nonsense. Multiculturalists are said to make debate impossible and to deny problems, and that's where the whole charge of political correctness comes in. And part of the rhetorical pattern, the concluding part is then, of course, to say that now a new realism is needed. The truth needs to be spoken. And the truth would be that they, all those foreigners, all those people who are visibly different from us, that they fail to integrate. The truth would also be that this failure to integrate is visible in their overrepresentation in crime statistics and in unemployment figures. And the time would have come for them, those foreigners, to fulfill their duties in exchange for the rights that they enjoy. And all this new realism basically comes down to is downright assimilationism under the pretext of inclusiveness. Now, we can no longer, in that kind of context, allow such patterns to develop. If politicians allow those to develop, if we as intellectuals and as analysts allow these to develop, then we can no longer escape a charge of complicity. Now, and then of course, we have to look at some of the practices. In order to evaluate this, we have to look at some of the practices, and I'll just give a Okay, I seem to be back. Okay, in a country like Belgium, for instance, politicians made very little opposition to the approval of a foreigner law, a new foreigner law, that allows, for instance, the expatriation of non-Belgians who are suspected of ties with terrorism or of being a serious risk for the public order. And it would even make such expatriation possible without any proven guilt. In a Belgian context, again, we had a Minister of Integration and Equal Opportunities. And that's ironic, of course, integration and equal opportunities. This minister claiming that racism is relative, and that racism is very commonly used for, well, as an excuse for personal failure. And then if you see that within the political elite, there is so little resistance against those kinds of really very practical implementations of a general movement of the type that I have just described, the question is, where does the willingness to remain complicit, where does it come from? It is not the result of the fact that all politicians are evil. They're not. Some of them are, yes, but they certainly are not all. It is also not the result of the fact that they are dumb, that they cannot think properly. There are very smart people amongst them. But current liberal democracy is experiencing what I would call the dark side of representative democracy. Politicians practicing what I would call meta-politics, which means that rather than to diagnose problematic processes and structures and to formulate sustainable remedies, they construct with the help of spin doctors, easy to remember, slogan-like analyses of complex social realities, which they imagine to be powerful enough to convince a big portion of the electorate. Now, in this process, staying on message is more important than accurate representation of facts or consistent arguments. And then some of those politicians go the extra mile to identify themselves as the only true representatives of the people, as opposed to a cultural, intellectual, economic, political elite. And this is, of course, what we call populism. Now, within populist movements, simple messages that may be, you get lots of simple messages that may be blatant lies. And I don't have to give you examples from recent history, but we all know that if blatant lies are repeated often enough, they can incite to action, as was the case with the mob that was raiding the US Capitol on the 6th of January. But what may be more harmful even is politicians' assumptions about public opinion, which may end up dictating their own actions against their own better judgment. You can see this when politicians take U-turns. So they take U-turns which they then justify on the basis of a realistic assessment of the popular mood. To give you a very concrete recent example, so in a Belgian context again, so there was a proposal which basically all political parties agreed with, a proposal no longer to tax the possession of cars, but to tax the use of cars in an attempt to contribute to the protection of the environment. Everybody agreed with that, but then at a certain moment, there was an opinion poll, and it turned out that many people would be opposed to that kind of change. So what do politicians say? They say there is no popular basis for this. So we do not get sufficient support, so let's forget about it. Now, what you also get is an exploitation of easily manipulable emotions in the pursuit of ideologically inspired objectives. And that is why within the same discourse world, you can, on the one hand, get something that I would call the culture of doubt or the culture of denial in opposition to a culture of fear. So examples of a culture of denial or a culture of doubt would be cases in which you discursively minimize risk in order to pursue a course of action that you give preference to. Examples of that are, again, in the context of global warming. For a very long time, politicians have been, in many countries, have been minimizing the risks discursively. They have created doubt around it, if not outright denial, which allowed them to just keep going in the direction that they were going anyway. So on the basis of an assessment of their own political goals, they adapt the discourse surrounding an area that is in itself to be defined as a problematic area. In opposition to that, you get the culture of fear. So in other cases, it may be convenient for politicians not to minimize the risks discursively, but to maximize them discursively. And that is what we have seen happening in the context of the so-called threat of migration and terrorism. So COVID-19, many politicians were minimizing the risks, erratically moving in whatever direction they thought could foster their own public standing, but in opposition to that, when things related to migration or terrorism were at issue, then they found it very convenient to maximize the risk and to create a context of fear. Now, the main problem is that metapolitics is not only practiced by those we recognize very easily as populists. The populists, indeed, they play hardball, but others give their softball responses, and they are basically playing the same game, but in a less forceful manner. And an example of that would be a Dutch socialist, yes, a socialist, not somebody from the extreme right, a socialist proposing very seriously the immediately ferrying back refugees arriving on Greek islands. And this was applauded by a number of other moderate or even leftist politicians in countries ranging from France over Belgium to all the way to Denmark. And another example would be the Dutch Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, who was a number of years ago celebrating victory of his party over the extreme right, proclaiming that after Brexit and after the American elections in which Trump won, so it's a few years ago, that after Brexit and the American elections, he had managed to halt, and literally quoting him, the wrong kind of populism. Now, okay, is this admission of guilt? I don't know, but basically what he was doing was playing softball in response to the hardball that populists were playing. The metapolitics restructures democratic public spheres and the discourses, practices, and institutions that inform them. And the basic point is that very essential, important content tends to evaporate. And we, to a certain extent, are complicit in this by not putting up enough resistance. What is the basis of metapolitics? Well, metapolitics is grounded in human nature. We must imagine what is happening in someone else's mind. Otherwise, we cannot even set up forms of collaboration or cooperation. And as linguists, we know that without imagining what is happening in other people's minds, making hypotheses about that, using theory of mind, to use the psychological terminology, without imagining what is happening in other people's minds, we wouldn't even know how to start talking. We couldn't use language the way we use it, because language, by definition, can make only some things explicit and has to carry along a whole world of implicit meaning with it. And in order to be able to do that, you must assume that there is a level of meaning that you do not have to make explicit, because it's already there in people's minds. Now, when in the public sphere, action is no longer determined by careful consideration of the intrinsic value of goals to be achieved, but more exclusively by considerations of what is needed to get or keep a position of power, namely by considerations of what you think is happening in other people's minds, and taking that into account in such a way that it enables you to direct discourse at them that will facilitate your getting a position of power or maintaining a position of power, then what you get then is not the normal, efficient, justifiable use of theory of mind or reflexivity, but it is a form of what I would call derailed reflexivity. Now, derailed reflexivity, I have used the term earlier, but in fact, the first time I used it, it was in a lecture that I was giving a few years ago in Curitiba. So this is a good point to come back to it. Now, derailed reflexivity is not a different kind of phenomenon than ordinary reflexivity, which we absolutely need to be able to function as social beings. So it is not a new analytical notion, but it is basically a moral category which we can somehow analytically apply. We can analytically apply it by setting some kind of moral standard and carefully evaluating what is observed as measured against that standard. Now, why do we need a moral category? Well, for the same reason as why we hold this conference, namely for reasons of resistance in a context of troubles. Now, we also need a moral category because it extends across domains of action. So politics is only one of them. I'll come back to a couple of others later. It spreads across a range of domains of actions so that it threatens to affect our quality of life in general. And now, how can we handle this notion? Well, let me give a simple example. So a simple example, which is also, well, action and discourse based. So a number of years ago, at the time when there had been a few very serious terrorist attacks in European countries, we developed the habit of placing armed soldiers in certain parts of certain cities to patrol. Now, and this was justified by politicians saying that this was necessary because only armed soldiers had the necessary operational firepower to counter terrorism. But of course, we are already at that point involved in a form of derailed reflexivity or metapolitics. So why is that? Because, okay, well, if you place armed soldiers in very specific spots, you identify useful targets. So it's counterproductive in that sense already. Moreover, it is also very clear that a couple of armed soldiers are not going to stop a suicide attack. So what you're dealing with is a form of security theater, and that already is a form of derailment of reflexivity. But it goes further. So some of those soldiers were spotted wearing what looked like Palestinian keffiyehs. So the kind of scarf that also Yasser Arafat used to run around with. And immediately, as soon as pictures of those soldiers were picked up, immediately army spokespersons started to apologize in an uncalled for public statement. So no objections had been made by anybody because it was pretty clear that what these soldiers were wearing had nothing to do with Palestine or with Palestinians, but that these were just souvenirs they had brought with them from some other mission abroad. So no objections had been raised, but the army authorities or politicians responsible for them thought it was necessary to jumpstart an anticipatory response controlling media effort. So that's another example. Now, the notion of derailed reflexivity is useful in the analysis of what goes on in the handling of diversity, and specifically the generalized and even institutionalized suspicion of Islam that is developing in quite a number of liberal democracies of the West or the global North. Now, and how do you set standards and how do you relate them to practices? Now, a standard in relation to diversity, if you remember what I've been saying about diversity so far, a basic moral standard is respect. and solidarity. And of course, these are complex notions, and I don't have the time to go into detail in those, but intuitively, you know what I'm talking about. A moral standard is respect for diversity and solidarity as far as possible. But what is the practice? What is the practice and also the discourse practice? What you find, for instance, is, and I will not be able to give all the examples that I could be giving. I will have to restrict myself to just a few things in the context of this talk. One example of a practice that contradicts the standard and which therefore can be identified as an instance of such unhealthy, derailed reflexivity is something that I would like to call enlightened condescension. Now, where does that notion come from? Well, within the context within which a general public or many politicians or in a context in which many politicians think that the general public does not want to see forms of diversity, you get incredibly long-spun debates, like debates about the wearing of headscarves. So, and within these debates, you get a rationalization of the ban on headscarves in specific institutional contexts, for instance. You get a rationalization on the basis of principles of laicism. In spite of the fact that the whole notion of laicism, if you look at it historically, has nothing to do with being anti-religious in any way. No, laicism had to do with a separation of the power of the state from any power that could come from the church. That's a very different kind of thing. It had nothing to do with the visibility of and the practicing of different religions, not at all. Now, in this specific case, the wearing of headscarves is seen as in violation of laicism because of the fact that adherence to a specific religion would be visible. Now, not only laicism is used as an argument, but in certain contexts also hygiene is used as an argument. And there actually we get very good indications for the fact that the whole ban on headscarves is very much based on suspicion of Islam specifically and nothing else. It has nothing to do with a general principle of laicism. It has to do with suspicion of Islam, institutionalized suspicion of Islam. And the case I'm thinking of is, for instance, the case of nurses in hospitals. So at a certain moment, when, of course, in a diversified society, we do get Islamic women who become nurses and are employed in hospitals. Now, in one specific case, well, in many cases, they are forbidden to wear their headscarves in the hospitals. But in one specific case, the hospital directors had thought they had found an excellent solution to solve any sort of tension that existed there. What they did was to reintroduce the traditional hospital caps. And they thought everybody will be happy now because Islamic women will have their head covered and other nurses will have their head covered as well. And this will not be recognized as something Islamic. No, it will be recognized as traditional hospital gear. Forgetting, of course, that the traditional hospital caps are very reminiscent of what Catholic nuns used to wear in hospitals. So it makes it very clear that what it's all about is not laicism. It is not principles of hygiene. No, it is what this is all about is suspicion of Islam, very generalized and very institutionalized. Now, why do I introduce the notion of enlightened condescension here? Well, because the whole notion of laicism is, of course, related to enlightenment. And it is the Enlightenment advocates who, at the same time, are displaying condescension towards Muslim women on the assumption that they cannot take decisions for themselves, because their further argument is, well, okay, they are obliged to wear those headscarves, so they are the victim of male dominance, and we cannot allow that, as if they would not be able to judge this for themselves and to act accordingly. It is also condescension towards the general public, because if you think that if somebody is recognizably Islamic within a social service context, for instance, that there would be the possibility that some people would take offense, then you underestimate the ability of the general public, of course, to look through symbols and just to see the human beings behind them. Now, in the same context of the handling of diversity, well, we also get a large amount of discourse about the justification of borders and even the justification of walls. Now, in relation to migration policies, for instance, we can see that there has been a development over the last 40, 50 years, where originally, when in a European context, migrant workers were allowed in, this was on the basis of economic motivations. They were needed as workers. Then from the moment in the 1970s, when they were no longer needed as workers so much, then a new mechanism for underlying migration was developed, namely a judicial basis was developed, where, for instance, the principle was that family reunifications would have to be possible. And this was legally founded, so a judicial basis. But as the French author François Héran explains very clearly, what has developed more recently is no longer an economic policy, no longer a judicially based policy, but a politique d'opinion, politics of opinion, where politicians are simply making use of what they think is generalized suspicion of Islam in order to curb migration. And of course, this generalized suspicion is something which they themselves, by doing this, are very strongly contributing to. And this is an excellent example, I would say, of a form of derailed reflexivity, where the official reasons that are given have to do, are not related to any real analysis of a situation, but more with an estimate of what a general public would carry along as attitudes towards this situation. And this has to be taken into account in order, of course, to keep positions of power in society. Now, okay, I see that I'm already talking for nearly 55 minutes, so I have to cut this short. I have more things to say in relation to the handling of diversity, for instance, in the context of how language is handled, because as linguists, of course, that is of prime concern to us. So in a Belgian context, again, we define people who do not speak the local language as other linguals. And we have all kinds of regulations that restrict the use of other languages as well. So even, for instance, there are regulations on access to social housing, which enable authorities, local authorities, to block entrance to social housing or access to social housing on the basis of a lack of proficiency in the local language. Now, if there is anything, that can be defined as discriminatory, this certainly is an example. Now, okay, so much for developments in society, but I told you at the very beginning, this phenomenon of derailed reflexivity, which seems to be, which within the world of politics creates this level of meta-political considerations and action based on that. Now, in other areas of society, we find similar kinds of developments. We find derailment of reflexivity as well. And for an example of that is what is happening at universities. So in education. Now, education is an extremely important field. And as I indicated at the very beginning, if we want to put up a form of resistance against developments that we see as problematic, then the most powerful long-term tool for doing that is education. And within the context of education, higher education, as the basis, as the place where research is done, that education is based on, then, universities have a very important role to play here. But what is happening at institutions of higher education is more and more that people are in a very within a very neoliberal paradigm in which meritocracy reigns, and there are winners and losers. And to identify winners and losers, you have to be able to measure. And that is why you get something that these days I would call an academic cytokine storm. So cytokines are very important to fight infections, but if they go into overdrive, they kill the body. Now, evaluation and evaluative reflexivity and meritocracy, they can be important, useful principles, but they can also derail. And derailed forms we find now in the extent to which attention is paid to peer reviewing, but that is still okay. But there are lots of parasitic activities, such as rankings and benchmarking and things like that, which are beginning to steer our activities as academics. No longer thinking about what it is that we are dealing with in essence, but thinking about all kinds of parameters that have to be satisfied in order for us to get good evaluations. Now, and this is something that is very difficult to escape from, but not escaping means complicity. And in this context, I probably have to plead guilty. So when I was a dean of my faculty, I was trying to put up some resistance there, but not very successfully. And why wasn't that very successful? Because the system shows a light form of totalitarianism, where if you are responsible at a certain level, at the level of the faculty, for instance, then you have to be protective to the people that you are responsible for, which means that you have to make sure that the people you are responsible for manage to be positively evaluated at a higher level where basically the standards are set. And so in a very real sense, you get involved in playing the game that is not designed by yourself, that is not based on your own assessment of what is essential in your life as an academic, but in all kinds of peripheral considerations that guide your action. Another area in which derailed reflexivity is so easy to spot is the world of the media. So the world of the media, where we do not only get this funneling of information, So where you would normally think that competition would produce diversity, no, as Pierre Bourdieu already explained in the 1990s, competition in the media produces homogenization and not diversity, because all media outlets are looking at each other and they are so much afraid of missing things that someone else is focusing on, that you get a real funnel and for all the information that is in essence available. And this is very tragic, because the means of communication and the means of getting to know things have never been as powerful as they are today. But in fact, that power is wasted to a very large extent. This also has to do with the economization within the media, where opinion journalism is much cheaper than investigative journalism, and so on. You also see the derailed reflexivity and reflexivity that is put on display. Like, for instance, journals now introducing an ombuds function, which in principle would have to be a useful thing because it would guard the quality, but which is actually used basically for display to the outside world of how reflective they really are. So basically a tool to present themselves to the outside world as very responsible about what they do. Now, I could go on like that, but I think my time is mostly up, so let me round up here. And to finish up, I would say, the difficult exercise that we all have to make, also as researchers and as educators, is to move away to a certain extent from blaming others and really trying, to the extent of the possible, to take responsibility, so to share responsibility for the things that are happening in the world. And one thing that as academics and as analysts of discourse in particular, we can contribute to is, well, doing very decent research on public discourse to such an extent that we can contribute somehow to an ecology of the public sphere, which would enable us, well, what we would have to try to do is to educate people to see through discourse processes that that have negative effects, and to see through discourse processes in such a way that we are also enabled to change practices, or at least to contribute to some attempts to change practices. One piece of advice that we could, for instance, give is that maybe all media outlets should be forced to publish a warning on all their products, in much the same way as the tobacco industry is forced to put warnings on packages of cigarettes. So every media product should carry the warning that unreflective consumption of what is contained in that package of information that is being presented, that unreflective consumption of that information is necessarily dangerous to one's health. And okay, I have passed my time, I think, so I should stop here and give back the floor to the people at the other side of the screen.
Hi, Professor Jack. Thank you very much for this such an instigating discussion. You certainly gave us a lot to think for a lot of time. We have to watch it again and consider, because there is a great deal of information and considerations. among people here, we have got some quite interesting questions, and I have a long one to read for you. You can also probably follow in the comments on your screen, but as it follows is, Jeff, some outsider agents in the political game, like Steve Bannon, Trump, and Bolsonaro, who was an irrelevant French representative, are perhaps the best practitioners of meta-politics. It seems that their meta-discourse, meta-politics, has been not only amplified, but also enabled by a tectonics of digital networks that has been marshaled by these agents in aid of their goals. It seems like traditional politicians, the ones who somehow are pro-diversity, and other agents like academia and etc., haven't grappled with this sort of digital agents. Therefore, what I would ask is, how do you think that we could marshal the record of pragmatic research that we have to provide a big picture of what is going on? In other words, how may we rethink responsibility, complicity, and the massive support to these politicians with what we have been on record, our pragmatic knowledge, but also what would be the gaps in our knowledge? Maybe cybernetics, complex systems. It's such a interesting question, Professor, so I give you the word.
Okay, thank you. That's indeed a very interesting question and a very complex one. It's a little bit too long, actually, to pick up all the elements there. But if I try to reduce the question to what I think the essence is, then I would say yes, indeed. The digital possibilities have definitely played a very important role in the way in which the prototypical populists, the way in which the prototypical populists have gained power and have been able to maintain power. But it's not only a product. This is not only a product of the digital communication possibilities. So there is a very interesting little book that Michael Silverstein wrote, comparing the discourse of earlier presidents in the United States with the discourse of George W. Bush. Now, George W. Bush is very well known for not being a very eloquent person at all. So, but nevertheless, he was also pretty successful in convincing the rest of America that a certain number of things were necessary, such as occupying Afghanistan, which is a very actual theme at this very moment. He was also very successful in pushing through the attack on Iraq, for instance, but he was not an eloquent person at all. What Silverstein identifies as the key to his success was in fact his simplicity. Was the fact that he managed to do what within political discourse would be called staying on target. So just identifying a very simple message, which you then stick to, and which you keep repeating and repeating and repeating. And now this is, of course, something that for which you do not necessarily need the digital tools that we have available, but the digital tools, they facilitate this. They facilitate this they have as an effect, as I was trying to explain very briefly, have as an effect that you also get fragmentation of the public sphere. It has, of course, always been the case that everybody was making choices of the types of media that they were following. So somebody would be reading the New York Times, someone else would be reading America Today, and these choices were always made, and it was important what choice you made to get an identification of the messages that you would get. But what is happening with the development of the digital media is that even while those traditional media are still more comparable than they are different, within the digital universe, you can create really different islands of meaning, islands of communication, which are very difficult to escape from, and with which you can then create worlds of meaning that that if you get enough, if you can pull enough people within a specific world of meaning, well, then you have an established base, power base. Yes, these are processes that that we have to be able to analyze, but what is especially important is that we have to find means of cutting through the fragmentation that is the result of the creation of all these internet bubbles that now exist side by side. And I don't know how to do that. So, and in that sense, yes, it is definitely the case that that we do need research on what is happening on social media to be able to find ways of, well, penetrating bubbles, cutting through divides. And I am not an expert on this, so I cannot give any specific directions in which research would have to develop in order to achieve that. But that is definitely a very important concern and a very important goal to have, and a very important contribution that we can potentially make. I know that some people are doing really very important and interesting research on social media, and I would be surprised if that could not be used to, well, to instigate some forms of action that could be beneficial. The other side to that is, of course, that whatever insights we gain there can also definitely be abused. Spin doctors are not naive. They know what they are doing. They know the workings of the media. So in the long run, I think the only real hope that we have is that we can, on a very large scale, educate people to teach them how to understand all these processes, how to look through these processes, how to evaluate forms of information that they are confronted with. And the stumbling block for that road is, of course, well, not only that this is a very long-term kind of project, but the stumbling block is also that in order to do this on a massive scale, you already need a form of public and political support, because most education is politically funded. So it's not an easy situation we're dealing with, but that doesn't mean that it's impossible. And I think that really orienting research in such a way that it can be used for really widespread education purposes is probably the main thing that we have to try and focus on. But,
thank you very much.
I don't know if I got all the aspects of the question, though.
Yeah, I think you were very thorough, but I would like to go a little bit further on your explanation, because I followed the work of Claire Wardle from Harvard, and she has been actually doing an exceptional job. And what she's trying to to do is a form of reinventing journalism. And in some ways, I question myself whether this is possible, because the way internet is configured, production of content is so widespread and it's so cheap, and it self-feeds the system that I'm not sure how journalism can reinvent, especially now that there are no funds and they can hardly pay the bills. We see journalists being set off. Do you think, is there any way that journalism can take a step forward and actually reinventing to help solve such a huge information issue?
Well, that's an extremely practical and difficult question. Now, I think that a certain form of reinvention of journalism is possible, but you would have to convince enough media institutions to go along in that. There is, of course, as you mentioned, the issue of finances. That is a serious issue, and that is why there is so much opinion journalism, as I said, rather than investigative journalism, because opinions are cheap. So it's very easy to get somebody's opinion. But what I see happening in the mainstream media is that there is an enormous amount of attention for things that the media companies think the audience wants. And this is an example of what I was referring to as derailed reflexivity, because there is this thinking about what is happening in the mind of the audience, but then instead of focusing on what is important for their audience, namely to get decent, valuable, truthful information, which is as nuanced and many-faceted as possible, instead of that, they start focusing on what they think would appeal more to the audience.
Exactly.
And for that reason, what you see in the mainstream media is an enormous amount of personalization.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of dealing with issues in an analytical way, they do something else. They will take somebody in the street, interview this person in the street, and that's the news, right? Though, of course, that is not the news. That is just entertainment, no more than that. And this is something that the media can change themselves. They can change this if they really want to. Now, another aspect, another of the development of the media that I see in the same way is that in addition to this personalization, what you get is this enormous value that is attached to so-called being there. That means that reporting from someone who is on the spot is supposed to be more interesting than other forms of reporting.
Mm-hmm.
But because there is not enough money for the main media companies to have lots of foreign reporters, for instance, no, they do something else. So what they do, for instance, is, well, okay, I see this all the time. I see this every day on the Belgian news. Well, when I watch it anyway, because sometimes it gets so annoying that you don't want to watch. Now, what I see all the time is that if something happens that is catastrophic, a disaster, then immediately the Belgian television station or the Flemish television station would send somebody to the location. And then what you have is you get shots of this person standing there telling you exactly what you already knew, right? No additional news value at all. It's only the idea that they must really regard the audience as stupid, you know, because most of the members of the audience can look through this. They know that it's not because this person is on the spot that he can tell you what he is telling you. Most of the time, they will be telling you anyway that they don't know anything additional yet. Yeah. So, and if something additional becomes known, then you will, with modern communication technology, get to know it anyway. You don't have to have somebody on the spot there. And they do this systematically when there is a disaster, when there is something spectacular happening, but not for real investigative purposes, not at all. And a reinvention of journalism in the sense that these kinds of practices can be banned and that attention can be paid again to content, well, that is possible. And that does not necessarily in itself have to cost too much.
Yeah, very well said, because we have another question here related with the affection, and you actually touched in a very important aspect that Claire Wardle always mentions, is the emotional relationship we developed with the news. And in some way, it is related, instead of social media having this emotional relationship, and journalism stands by itself and say, no, this is not the kind of thing we do. It went around, and then, okay, we also want this emotional relationship, and then viewers expect emotional content, and then subjectivity takes place instead of, an actual, expression of facts. And then this Jair Oliveira, he brings us a question about, the affective aspect. And he says, the pandemia, don't you think it has contributed to this affective turn in interpersonal relationships and also in institutions? So therefore, the affective capital has become more evoked, more searched for by institutions.
Well, I don't know if I can evaluate that. So actually, it's a very interesting idea, and I have not given that any thought. But if you let me think aloud, then honestly, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know what has been happening in institutions in relation to focus on affective issues. I don't know. And I certainly don't see the connection there with the COVID-19 epidemic. COVID-19 has had all kinds of effects, also on communication traditions. It has, to a large extent, as far as I can see, because I am no longer really part of a real institution, in the sense that I have been officially retired for a number of years. So I have no direct institutional responsibilities at this moment at the university. But to the extent that I have remained active, and to the extent that I have been involved in meetings, like for instance, I'm still part of a research council and things like that. And I've been attending lots of meetings, institutional meetings, in the past year and a half. But I would have the impression that that the focus has shifted more to functionality than to anything that I would designate in effective terms. functionality in the sense that, okay, if you have a meeting with 20 people and you're discussing a research project or something, there isn't even any way, any good way to indicate that you agree with the person who is talking at that very moment. You're also more reluctant to intervene because the communication has to be more structured. It's different if you have a very small scale meeting with just 3 or 4 people, for instance. But if you have another kind of institutional meeting, then my feeling was that it was getting much more formalized, and that anything that I would want to talk about in terms of affectivity was more sidelined, actually. But I would very much like to have a discussion about this, and I would like to know what the background is to this question here.
Well, Professor Jack, as much as your insights have given us a lot to think, unfortunately, our time has come to an end, and I can only say many, many, many thanks for this wonderful presentation and for you to have made yourself available for this interesting talk. And we look forward to have other talks and follow-ups on this discussion. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It was my pleasure, and I will always come back to Curitiba. Okay.
We look forward, maybe after the pandemic is under control, maybe we can have this discussion in person. It would be...
That would be a lot of fun. It would reintroduce affectivity. Okay.
That would be great. Thank you so much. I will hand it over to the organizers to change the screens. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Have a good day.